July 1940. An overcast afternoon, the kind of sky that hides everything until it opens. RAF Big Gin Hill was buzzing with usual activity, Spitfires taxiing, mechanics tightening bolts, fuel trucks inching past hangars. In the control tower, officers monitored radar sweeps, looking for blips. Then the unexpected, a single German aircraft, silver and clean, circled above the airfield, lowering undercarriage, and gliding into land. Ground crews froze. Pilots watching from their cockpits blinked. The Messerschmitt Bf 110's wheels touched down on the runway with practiced precision, dust spinning around its wheels. No shots were fired. No scramble order was given, no one believed it was real. But there it was. A German plane, in England, landing on one of Britain's most heavily defended airfields. The shadow of that moment stretched long and dark. In the minutes that followed, terrified technicians and officers gathered at the perimeter, rifles raised, hearts pounding. From the cockpit stepped a Luftwaffe pilot in full uniform, helmet under his arm, gaze calm but alert. He saluted the surprised British guards and requested to speak to the commanding officer. He carried no aeronautical damage, no battle scars, just himself and a mission. In control rooms, phones rang. Intelligence officers were summoned. Secret protocols activated. Everyone expected him to be a spy, a trickster, or a lunatic. But within hours, it became clear this was none of those things. The pilot introduced himself as Oberleutnant Franz Weisser. He claimed to have crashed behind enemy lines after navigation instruments failed, and managed to evade capture until now. He asked for asylum, offering cooperation under the Geneva Conventions. His request was extraordinary. The RAF escorted him off the runway, isolated in a guardhouse, and began the arduous process of verification. The aircraft itself was secured, cameras probing every panel, every rivet, every component for secrets. Was it rigged with bombs? A time device? Sabotage? Nothing was left to chance. Meanwhile, in dim back offices, cryptographers and intelligence analysts listened in and watched. They began decrypting messages, cross-referencing missing pilot logs, radio chatter. The British War Cabinet was alerted. Churchill himself demanded daily updates. What they discovered in the Bf 110's compartments was beyond expectation: maps of RAF sector deployments, Luftwaffe codebooks, detailed flight. 2 intelligence officers from Mi-5's B division had arrived by car within an hour of his landing. They sat across from him, notebooks ready, while the pilot adjusted his collar and explained, almost clinically, why he'd risked his life to come here. He wasn't there to surrender, at least not in the ordinary sense. He said he'd come to give the British something they didn't yet realize they needed. When asked why, he simply replied, "Because Germany will lose. And I would rather survive the fall than be buried with it." It wasn't what anyone expected to hear. His accent was crisp, his English excellent. He spoke of a Germany that had lost its soul to politics, a military now ruled by fear and propaganda. He'd joined the Luftwaffe out of patriotism, but what he'd witnessed since 1939 had shattered that pride. Cities burned for vanity. Crews were sent on suicide missions for political theater. They've turned pilots into martyrs before the fuel tanks are even filled, he said. His eyes were steady when he said it. One of the officers noted in his report, "Subject speaks as a man already dead to his nation." But Weisser hadn't just come with stories. He'd come with something tangible. In the seat compartment of his Messerschmitt were 2 canvas satchels, one filled with operational documents, the other with a small steel lockbox containing what appeared to be a coded flight directive stamped with Luftwaffe insignia. The papers detailed upcoming sorties, radar calibrations, and even the frequencies of German early warning systems along the Channel. To confirm authenticity, the documents were flown that same night to London, where codebreakers at Bletchley Park compared them with intercepted Enigma traffic. Within hours, the impossible was confirmed. Every page was genuine. The news raced through the corridors of power. Air Marshal Dowding received a direct call from Churchill's office. The defector was to be protected at all costs. The Air Ministry classified his arrival under "most secret" status, distributing information only to select intelligence and RAF leaders. Officially, the man didn't exist. His aircraft would later be recorded as destroyed at sea, his name scrubbed from all flight rosters. The British couldn't risk the Germans learning what had happened. Meanwhile, Weiser was transferred to a safe house in Surrey under the supervision of MI5. The debriefing continued over several days, and piece by piece, a larger picture began to emerge. He hadn't simply flown to England for ideological reasons. He was also carrying what might have been the most valuable military intelligence of the early air war, a complete breakdown of the Luftwaffe's radar detection network and operational range maps for night fighters. To the untrained eye, the diagrams looked like technical clutter. To British analysts, they were a revelation. For the first time, they could see how the Germans were coordinating their raids over Britain, where their detection blind spots were, and how the RAF could exploit them. One MI5 report described the discovery as the equivalent of turning on a light in a pitch-black room. British engineers compared the data to their own chain-home radar network and realized how dangerously close the Germans were to perfecting early detection methods. The information Weiser carried allowed Britain to reconfigure their countermeasures, adjusting frequencies, altering jamming patterns, and even feeding false radar echoes back toward occupied France. For the first time since the Blitz began, the British were not simply reacting to attacks, they were anticipating them. But even with his cooperation, suspicion lingered. Could he have been a plant? A carefully crafted deception? MI5's internal documents show that at least 3 intelligence chiefs believed it was a trap designed to mislead British radar strategy. As a result, Weiser was placed under constant surveillance. He was moved between 2 safe locations, guarded day and night, with every conversation monitored. Yet over time, his sincerity began to wear down their doubts. He never once contradicted himself. Every test question thrown at him, every fabricated piece of bait information, he corrected or ignored with the same measured confidence. He even identified Luftwaffe officers by voice from intercepted radio recordings, a feat that impressed his interrogators more than any map could. What truly convinced them wasn't his information. It was his understanding of how the war would unfold. He described, in chillingly accurate detail, how the Luftwaffe would shift from daylight raids to nighttime bombing campaigns over British cities. He predicted the relocation of German fighter groups closer to the Low Countries to intercept RAF bombers. These predictions, once dismissed as speculation, proved true within weeks. Every time British command compared his statements against new reconnaissance reports, they matched. In private, Air Chief Marshal Dowding referred to him as the man who landed from the future. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Weiser had flown in with the full machinery of Hitler's air war behind him, and now, that same machinery was being slowly disassembled from within, all because of one flight plan and one decision. When asked during his final debrief why he had chosen that specific airfield, he explained that he'd studied RAF patterns, weather conditions, and blackout procedures for months while pretending to plan long-range missions. I needed a base close enough to the coast for the flight, but deep enough to survive the landing, he said. Big Gin Hill was perfect. Your gunners never fire without orders. German gunners would have shot me before I reached the ground. By the end of his 5th day in captivity, MI5 concluded that Franz Weiser was genuine. His defection was classified as strategically priceless. The RAF now had its first accurate map of the Luftwaffe's technological backbone, and the British radar war, the invisible duel of frequencies, signals, and interception, had just tilted in their favor. All because one man, flying a machine built to destroy them, chose to land instead. It wasn't the man that made Churchill pause mid-sentence during his afternoon briefing, it was the briefcase. The satchel, retrieved from behind the pilot's seat of the Messerschmitt Bf 110, was standard Luftwaffe issue, leather-wrapped, stitched tight, stained with engine oil. But what lay inside it would send shockwaves through the war rooms of Britain. When handlers first opened it under strict security in a sealed room at Big Gin Hill, they found it packed with flight orders, transmission logs, airbase coordinates, and something even rarer, copies of high-level dispatches sent from Luftwaffe High Command to regional group leaders. These weren't scraps. They were gold. The documents were immediately bundled and flown by courier aircraft to Bletchley Park, where a select group of cryptographers and intelligence officers worked through the night to authenticate the material. Alan Turing wasn't present, but several of his colleagues were. What they uncovered wasn't just confirmation of existing suspicions, it was revelation. Inside the case were pages listing current Enigma machine settings, specifically those used by Luftwaffe 3, the air fleet responsible for bombing raids on southern England. The implications were devastating for Germany. With these sheets, British codebreakers could now calibrate their decryption efforts with pinpoint accuracy. The randomization patterns that had cost months of statistical labor could now be bypassed. Decoding Luftwaffe transmissions, once a laborious guessing game, had suddenly become a matter of procedure. For the first time in the war, the British knew not just when the raids would come, but where, how many aircraft, what routes they'd take, and what the fallback positions were. The briefcase had handed them the Luftwaffe's voice, unfiltered, uncensored, and live. And that wasn't all. Tucked into the side pocket was a folded hand-drawn map annotated in pencil. It showed the layout of several radar installations along the French coast, Freya and Wurzburg radar stations, complete with estimated signal ranges and coverage gaps. These names had appeared in intercepted communications before, but never with this clarity. The locations matched perfectly with reports from the French resistance and Royal Navy reconnaissance missions. More importantly, it revealed something that changed the calculus of British defensive strategy. The Germans weren't just tracking aircraft, they were beginning to coordinate their fighter wings based on radar interception data. A technological arms race was unfolding in the dark, and Britain had just skipped 3 moves ahead. MI6 sent an urgent cable to Whitehall. Subject's materials confirm suspected location and function of German early warning network. Recommend immediate adjustments to chain home south frequencies. Strong evidence of coordinated interception strategies now verified. The memo landed on Churchill's desk by morning. According to one aide, the Prime Minister read the dispatch, looked up, and said, "Then we've no time left for guessing. Let's give Jerry something to be confused about." What followed in the days after the briefcase's discovery was a complete overhaul of British air defense protocol. Chain-home radar stations began transmitting on alternate frequencies, throwing off enemy readings. RAF command squadrons were reassigned to cover previously exposed blind spots. Bomber command's flight paths were revised based on the map's radar arc projections. In essence, the Luftwaffe had unknowingly submitted their playbook, and the British had flipped to the final chapter. To exploit this sudden intelligence edge without tipping their hand, British intelligence constructed a careful web of misinformation. They began feeding limited truths through back channels, neutral countries, staged, accidental, leaks, and prisoner of war gossip. The goal was simple: convince Berlin that their codes were still safe, their radars still unseen, and their pilots still undetected. Meanwhile, RAF squadrons began intercepting German raids with uncanny precision, sometimes meeting formations at altitude before they'd even reached the coast. In Berlin, Luftwaffe planners blamed traitors, bad weather, even sabotage. They never suspected a single pilot had walked across the sky and delivered their secrets in a leather satchel. Not every officer in British command believed it was luck. Air Chief Marshal Dowding, pragmatic as always, wrote in a private letter, "The briefcase is a weapon more potent than 1,000 bombers. I dare say its contents have saved more lives than we can ever properly count. But it is not luck. It is leverage. And it must be used precisely." The briefcase remained under lock and key for the rest of the war, moved eventually to a secure vault in London. Decades later, the physical object would vanish from official records, never displayed, never declassified. But in notes from Bletchley Park and MI5 archives, its presence echoes like a thunderclap. Several breakthroughs in radar jamming, signal interception, and night fighter deployment can be traced directly to the contents of that satchel. As for Weiser, he never asked for anything in return. He didn't trade the briefcase for freedom. He didn't request money, asylum terms, or protection for family. He handed it over as if it were an obligation, like a man throwing a lever to stop a machine before it crushed more bones. When a British colonel asked him why he had risked so much, he replied, "Because I saw what you couldn't." The war is already lost. The question is how many die before someone admits it. That briefcase didn't just shift tactics. It altered perception. It proved that the enemy wasn't invincible, that their systems could be read, disrupted, reversed. It gave Britain something priceless, time. Time to prepare, to reposition, to rethink. And from that moment forward, the air war over Britain would never be the same again. The weeks that followed saw subtle, almost invisible changes in the air. RAF pilots didn't know it at first. They only sensed that something had shifted. Scramble orders became more accurate. Ground control vectors led them straight into the path of incoming bombers. Radar officers spoke with more confidence, directing squadrons not reactively, but proactively. It was as if British command had suddenly developed a sixth sense, one that could read the Luftwaffe's thoughts before they even took off. What they didn't realize was that behind this new clarity was a defector's briefcase and a war room that had just pulled off one of the most elegant sleights of hand in military history. At Bletchley Park, the Enigma sections were working faster than ever. Thanks to the sheets Weiser had brought with him, current rotor settings, plugboard wiring configurations, and key phrase structures, Turing's bomb machines began outputting decrypted messages in record time. Messages that used to take days to break were now readable within hours, sometimes minutes. Each intercept revealed German squadron schedules, aircraft dispositions, and even pilot call signs. And the British didn't just listen, they acted. The most immediate beneficiary was RAF Fighter Command. With every Enigma decryption, they could now chart German bomber paths across the Channel and align their squadrons with pinpoint accuracy. Squadron 303, the famed Polish unit stationed at Northolt, began intercepting Heinkel formations 20 miles earlier than usual. No one explained how they knew. Pilots just assumed luck was finally on their side. But it wasn't luck. It was data. Clean, current, priceless data that British planners used like a scalpel. And then came the radar revolution. Before Weiss's arrival, British chain-home radar stations operated with fixed frequencies, broad, easily detectable, and prone to jamming. The Germans had begun exploiting this, using interference beams to blind British early warning systems. But Weiss's maps detailed how German aircraft were using armboard detectors to listen for specific British radar emissions, allowing them to steer around detection zones like submarines avoiding sonar. With this insight, British scientists at the Telecommunications Research Establishment quickly recalibrated chain-home's output bands. They introduced frequency hopping and signal modulation to make the systems harder to detect, and even harder to spoof. The result was a significant reduction in blind interceptions and radar dead zones. In parallel, Bomber Command received its own windfall. The briefcase's targeting maps revealed German night fighter deployment corridors, so-called Heaven's Gates, and the relay stations used to vector fighters toward inbound British bombers. Armed with this, British night raids were rerouted around known hot zones, their formations tightened, their chaff and countermeasure deployments improved. For the first time, Lancaster and Wellington crews started returning in larger numbers. Casualty rates dropped. And morale, long eroded by the nightly meat grinder over the Ruhr, began to lift. One unsung development during this period was the birth of window, strips of aluminum foil dropped from bombers to confuse radar. Weiss's information confirmed how sensitive the German Freya systems were to clutter. So, in the summer of 1943, British bombers unleashed the first large-scale use of window over Hamburg. The result was devastation. German radar screens turned to snowstorms of false returns, rendering them useless. Fighters scrambled in the wrong directions. Anti-aircraft batteries fired blind. British losses plummeted. The city burned. All of it traced back to that quiet man who landed at Big Gin Hill and handed over the mechanics of a hidden war. To protect the secret, British intelligence adopted a ruthless discipline. Only a tiny circle within Whitehall, Bletchley, and Fighter Command knew the full truth about how their fortunes had changed. Pilots were told the radar had been upgraded. Intercepts were credited to improved triangulation. Engineers who implemented changes were given only fragments of the full picture. Everything was compartmentalized. Because if the Germans ever discovered how deep the leak had gone, they would change everything, and the brief advantage would vanish. But the Germans didn't change. In fact, they grew more confused. From their perspective, the RAF had simply become luckier, faster, sharper. Luftwaffe pilots returning from raids spoke of British fighters arriving out of nowhere, of being caught mid-turn, mid-climb, mid-fuel calculation. Some accused their own command of betrayal. Others blamed new British technology. Rumours of British radar-equipped night fighters spread. Morale among bomber crews deteriorated. Suspicion took root in Berlin. But the truth, one man's act of defection, never even crossed their minds. And while the British exploited this intelligence, they began to feed misinformation back toward occupied Europe. Using what they now knew of German radar and communication blind spots, they began staging dummy raids. Squadrons would fly toward certain targets only to divert at the last moment. Inflatable tanks and fake landing strips appeared across southern England. Radio chatter was faked. Even weather reports were manipulated. The goal wasn't just tactical deception, it was to sow doubt into the German decision-making process. To make them question every report, every intercept, every sighting. The results were profound. Luftwaffe command began repositioning squadrons to areas with no activity. Fighter groups were thinned across key sectors. And all the while, British planners had a live feed of their movements through decoded Enigma traffic. By the end of 1942, the balance in the air had shifted. RAF Fighter Command no longer fought just for survival, they were controlling the tempo. Bomber Command was hitting deeper, more often. And the once vaunted Luftwaffe, stretched thin from North Africa to the Russian front, could no longer react with certainty. Franz Weisse, meanwhile, remained in quiet seclusion. Under an assumed name, he was relocated to a country estate in Hertfordshire, guarded but not imprisoned. He was debriefed for months, consulted on radar diagrams, Luftwaffe doctrine, and aircraft specs. British engineers took his insights and quietly folded them into weapons testing programs. They never asked him for loyalty, only for information. And he gave it, without hesitation. The war had not been won. Not yet. But the tide had turned, invisibly, in 1,000 little ways. A bomber saved here, a radar jammed there, an interception that never happened because a frequency was changed just in time. These things weren't glamorous. They weren't headlines. But they added up. And they all began with a single decision, a German pilot who looked at the war machine around him and chose to stop it with wings instead of bullets. When word reached Berlin that a German pilot had landed intact on British soil, the reaction inside Luftwaffe High Command was volcanic. It wasn't immediate. At first, reports were confused, fragmentary. An aircraft missing from formation, presumed down in the Channel. Then rumors spread from occupied France that a Bf-110 had landed safely in England. By the time the truth reached Hermann Göring's desk, the story had grown into something close to treason. An officer, fully uniformed, had defected, delivered his aircraft intact, and possibly turned over documents. The idea was intolerable. Göring summoned his staff to a crisis meeting at the Air Ministry in Berlin, his fury echoing through the marble corridors. He demanded names, flight logs, anything that could identify the pilot. No German officer would surrender his aircraft to the enemy, he shouted. But they all knew one had. The official cover story was crafted within hours. The missing pilot, Franz Weisse, was declared dead, lost at sea during a coastal patrol. His squadron was instructed to record his disappearance as mechanical failure, presumed fatal. His family received condolences. His name was removed from the flight board. No one in Germany was to speak of him again. But inside the intelligence branches, panic was spreading. If the British had captured an aircraft intact, they would learn everything: the communication systems, the IFF transponders, the frequencies, the fuel mixtures. The Luftwaffe's technological advantage, already narrowing, could collapse overnight. Teams from the Forschungsamt, Göring's Secret Signals Bureau, were dispatched to audit every communications and radar unit in northern France. Officers were questioned, ground crews interrogated, encryption keys rotated. The Enigma settings were changed, not once but 3 times in as many weeks. But the damage was already done. Each change in cipher only helped confirm to the British that they had hit a nerve. Their decrypts showed the Luftwaffe stumbling in confusion, messages contradicting one another, units being repositioned without coordination. The German command structure was unraveling under the weight of its own paranoia. Göring's anger turned inward. He blamed the intelligence branch for laxity, then the radio operators, then the engineers. He suspected spies in the factories, traitors in the signals corps. Hitler himself was briefed by General Gisconnec, who downplayed the defection but could not deny the strange pattern of RAF successes. Coincidence, Gisconnec insisted. But Hitler wasn't convinced. He ordered an internal purge of the Luftwaffe's intelligence staff and demanded the creation of a loyalty verification system for all pilots flying within range of Britain. Within a month, random inspections, background checks, and field interrogations became the new normal. For the men flying daily missions, it was madness. Experienced crews were grounded for investigation. New pilots were sent up in their place, many barely trained. Distrust spread faster than morale could keep up. Pilots began destroying navigation notes before takeoff, terrified of being accused of treason if shot down. Some even carried cyanide capsules, swearing they'd never be taken alive. A defector was bad enough, but a defector who had given the enemy a technological edge was unthinkable. Inside Germany's intelligence community, the fear went deeper. What if the defection wasn't just betrayal, but the beginning of something larger? Whispers emerged that Weisse might have been part of an organized resistance within the Luftwaffe, an idea that terrified Nazi leadership. Investigators scoured letters, phone logs, even diaries of senior officers. Several were arrested on suspicion of defeatist attitudes. None were connected to Weisse, but the damage was done. The Luftwaffe's culture of camaraderie, built on trust between pilots, was gone. Now every man flew under the shadow of suspicion. The paranoia even reached the front lines. Ground controllers, fearing interception, began withholding vector data from pilots until the last possible moment. Radio silence was enforced with brutal discipline. Entire squadrons flew blind into combat zones, uncertain of their orders until they saw enemy contrails above them. RAF interception rates climbed sharply, but Berlin didn't understand why. They only saw the symptom: pilots dying in increasing numbers, aircraft disappearing without contact. Göring tried to reassert control with public bravado. He visited frontline bases, delivering fiery speeches about loyalty and honor, promising rewards for anyone who exposed traitors. But the faces staring back at him were tired and skeptical. They'd seen too many disappearances, too many sudden reassignments. One officer, writing in a private letter later intercepted by British censors, summed it up: "The English do not have to bomb us. We are tearing ourselves apart." Meanwhile, British analysts at Bletchley Park watched the chaos unfold through the steady rhythm of intercepted transmissions. They could see the panic in the changing code patterns, the frantic requests for verification, the contradictory flight orders. To them, it was confirmation that the defectors' intelligence had struck deep. "The Germans are flying blind," one report read. "Our window of advantage is open. Exploit fully." And they did. In the skies over France, the RAF began winning engagements that had once seemed impossible. Fighter sweeps were planned to coincide with Luftwaffe confusion. Bombing runs over industrial targets met minimal resistance. German night fighters were sent to intercept phantom raids broadcast through falsified radio chatter. For every genuine sortie, the RAF staged 2 decoys, each one pulling German fighters further into disarray. The psychological toll was enormous. Veterans who had once mocked the British now spoke of uncanny foresight. "They are waiting for us before we arrive," one pilot wrote in his log before being shot down 2 days later. In time, the story of the defector faded from official memory, replaced by the larger disasters to come: Stalingrad, El Alamein, the Ruhr campaign. But within the Luftwaffe's upper ranks, his shadow never left. Hitler ordered periodic reviews of pilot backgrounds well into 1944, always citing the Big Gin Hill incident as a reminder that a single act of betrayal could cost the RAF the skies. And in truth, it had. The internal purge, the fear, the distrust, it did more damage than any British bomb could have. Göring's Air Force, once a disciplined machine, was now riddled with insecurity. Communications grew slower, decisions more cautious, and initiative evaporated. The Luftwaffe didn't collapse overnight, it bled out, quietly, strangled by paranoia. All because one man decided to turn his aircraft toward the enemy and land. The man who had landed on British soil with nothing but a briefcase and a war-worn conscience never appeared in the newspapers. There were no photos, no interviews, no medals. His name, Franz Weisser, was scrubbed from both German and British records within months. To the public, the pilot never existed. But in closed war rooms, whispered corridors of intelligence, and certain classified footnotes at Bletchley Park, his impact was permanent. The decision to keep his defection secret wasn't about fear of retaliation, it was about preservation of the edge he had given them. If Berlin found out the truth, they would change everything. The real power of the briefcase was not just what it revealed, it was that the Germans never knew it had been lost. Weisser's fate after the war is still a mystery. Some say he was quietly folded into Britain's military intelligence infrastructure under a new name, contributing to post-war planning during the Cold War. Others suggest he was given a cottage in the countryside under round-the-clock protection, living as a ghost of a man who once flew for the RAF. There are even rumors he was traded back to Germany in a post-war prisoner negotiation, only to be executed in secret. But these are shadows. The truth was buried by design. And it wasn't just Weisser's identity that was locked away, it was the entire incident. Internal RAF memos from the 1950s reference the defection only by code name, Case Echo Dusk. Why bury such a seismic event? Because the war had changed since that day. The Allies had developed newer technologies, H-2S radar, oboe navigation systems, jet propulsion. Weisser's intelligence had been critical in 1942 and 1943. But by 1945 it had been folded so deeply into operational doctrine that no one could point to it directly anymore. His fingerprints were everywhere, but invisible. The pilot who had once shifted the momentum of the air war became a silent thread in a tapestry of victories. Historians missed him, partly because they weren't supposed to find him. The German archives listed Weisser as KIA, lost in action over the Channel. His flight log ends abruptly. His Luftwaffe personnel file contains a single stamped word, verschollen. Missing. In the British National Archives, early debriefing transcripts are redacted entirely, with names removed and key pages marked, restricted until 2045. A few enterprising researchers who stumbled across the story in the 1980s assumed it was a fabrication, a Cold War ghost story. But at Bletchley Park, in one of the original decoding huts now turned into a museum, there is a photograph, unlabeled, of a tall, thin man in civilian clothes standing beside a chalkboard radar diagram. No one knows his name. No one asks. What matters more than the man, is the moment. His landing changed the course of Britain's air war, not in a single, dramatic stroke, but in 100 invisible ways. Every time an RAF fighter intercepted a bomber before it reached London, every time a bomber slipped through a German radar gap, every time British command anticipated German troop movements, it was his voice, echoing through the decisions. His gift was clarity. Clarity in a war built on noise. Perhaps the greatest testament to his impact was how quickly the British understood the value of silence. There was no parade, no broadcast, no special commendation. Not because it wasn't deserved, but because recognition would have undone everything. The British didn't need a martyr, they needed an advantage. And Weisser, whether he realized it or not, had become that advantage. By war's end, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Worn thin, stretched across too many fronts, plagued by distrust and poor intelligence. Many would attribute its decline to Allied bombing campaigns, dwindling fuel, or better aircraft. But in truth, one of its greatest wounds was internal, psychological. The moment a German pilot landed willingly on British soil and shared their secrets, a crack appeared in the mythology of Nazi invincibility. It suggested that even those closest to the RAF's war machine no longer believed in it. And that mattered. The war was fought with planes and bombs and bullets, but it was won with decisions. A pilot choosing not to drop his payload. A radio officer choosing not to jam a signal. A defector choosing to land on the enemy's runway instead of returning home. These decisions never made headlines. They didn't shape public opinion. But they shaped victory. Weisser's plane was eventually dismantled, studied piece by piece, and used in RAF training sessions on enemy aircraft. Its serial number was erased, repainted, then scrapped. It never flew again. But its final flight had already made history. In the end, perhaps that was enough for the man who gave it up. Somewhere in England, it said, there's an unmarked grave at the edge of a forgotten airfield. Just a flat stone, no name, no dates. But every year, without fail, a single white rose appears on it each November. No one knows who places it there. And no one ever talks about Franz Weisser. But the war remembers him. Quietly. Completely. Forever.